Peter is a leading entertainment lawyer. He's counsel at McCarthy Tétrault. He has literally written the book on communications law in Canada. Peter was named Best Lawyers 2011 Toronto Entertainment Lawyer of the Year in 2011. And Peter is here to give an overview of the recent research related to the CRTC's group licensing framework. With this research and a crystal ball, Peter is going to lay the table for what the industry has in store for the next 5 years. So Peter, welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. I wonder if we can put up my first slide. Oh, there it is. Well, I'm here to talk about the CRTC's group licensing framework and how it will affect independent television production in Canada. It's a complex topic, and I feel a bit like Zsa Zsa Gabor's fifth husband on their honeymoon night. And he says, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I only hope I can make it interesting. Now, last summer, we saw a fundamental change in the CRTC's approach to television licensing. It was a move away from a focus only on individual TV licenses towards a new concept of imposing an expenditure requirement on a group of licenses, or to pick up Robert's theme, on a group of multiple platforms. And today I'm going to talk about the impact of this change on the independent production sector, and it will be profound. To properly analyze the situation, we start with the fact that there are now 6 major, let's see if we can get this here, 6 major group owners of English television in Canada. And last summer, the CRTC renewed the licenses of 4 of these 6 groups. And those 4 were Bell Media, Shaw Media, Rogers Media, and Chorus. And that leaves 2 major English language group owners where the CRTC licenses are still to be renewed. One is Astro Media, where the hearings have concluded and we're now waiting for the license renewal decision. And of course, last but certainly not least, is the CBC. And the CBC's renewal hearings were originally planned for last fall, but those hearings were canceled, and they've been postponed pending the settling of its budget by the Harper government next month. And of course, they will hope to see the naming of a new CRTC chairperson. Now, last July, at the same time as it introduced the concept of imposing an expenditure requirement on the group of TV licenses, the Commission also introduced a new regulatory policy that will have a dramatic impact on independent television production in this country. And that policy introduced the concept of programs of national interest, or PNI. And what is PNI? Well, the new designation of programs of national interest consists of 3 types of Canadian programs: drama and comedy, long-form docs, and Canadian award shows that celebrate Canadian creative talent, like the Juno Awards. Now, the PNI policy is the latest effort by the Commission to address the single most difficult problem in Canadian broadcasting, and that's how to support high-cost Canadian drama and comedy production. So having defined what constitutes a PNI program, the Commission went on to propose an expenditure requirement. However, instead of applying the PNI requirement to the individual programming service license, the Commission decided to apply it to the group of services or platforms owned by each major private broadcaster. And given the fact that each of the major private broadcasters have multiple programming services upon which they can place these programs of national interest, this made eminent good sense. Drama and comedy have library value, and after their initial exposure on one platform, they can be subsequent runs on the other services. And so that brings one to the actual calculation of the PNI requirement. And in 2010, the Commission decided that this requirement would be calculated as a ratio of the overall revenue of all of the programming services owned by the group, other than mainstream sports or news, or digital specialty services with less than 1 million subscribers. And the actual ratio itself became crystallized in the renewal decisions for the major broadcasters issued last July. And based on their historical P&I spending, the Commission set a P&I ratio of 5% for each of Bell Media and Shaw Media, 2.5% rising to 3% for Rogers, and 9% for Chorus. Now, before we examine how much each of these broadcasters is required to spend on P&I over the next 5 years, and I'm going to share my projections with you, it may be useful to review just what broadcast services each of these broadcasters owns and controls. The reason is, of course, that the new rules look at all the broadcast services each broadcaster owns, not just the over-the-air services. So you have to include the pay and the specialty services as well. And in looking at these assets, we have 4 categories to look at. First, the over-the-air TV services. Second, the Category A services, so-called. These are the ones that benefit from niche protection and must-carry rules. And third, Category B services. These are digital services with no niche protection or must-carry. However, if a Category B services reaches 1 million subscribers, it too becomes part of the system to support P&I. And then fourth, Category C services, which are news and mainstream sports channels, and these services are not required to support P&I. So with that in mind, let's quickly review what each broadcaster owns in English Canada. We'll start with the CBC, and as you can see, the CBC's main asset is still the over-the-air stations, but they do control 2 Category A services, Bold and Documentary, as well as their news channel. Then we come to Bell Media. You can see it owns the CTV stations, a bunch of Category A services, including Bravo, Comedy, and Space, a number of Cat B services, over 1 million subs, and 2 Category C services, TSN and CTV News Channel. Then we come to Shaw Media. It owns the global stations, a bunch of Category A's and B's, including Showcase, History Television. Then we come to Rogers Media. It has a smaller number of services, the City TV and Omni stations, and Sportsnet being the key one. And I've also added FX Canada to the list. It's a digital service they just introduced last month, but I expect it may eventually reach over 1 million subscribers, in which case it too has to be part of the P&I system. And then we come to Chorus. It owns a few minor TV stations in Kingston and Peterborough, but its main assets are services like YTV, W Network, and Movie Central. And finally, we look at Astral, and in the English language, it has 3 Category A pay TV services. Now we get into the math. And the first question I want to ask is this: what have each of these broadcasters actually spent on English language Canadian drama in the last 3 years? And this will give us a base upon which we can then compare with the projections for the future. So let's start with the CBC. Here's a chart showing what the CBC spent on English language Canadian drama over the past 3 years, including both its over-the-air services and its 2 specialty services. You'll see it spent $81 million in 2008, but the number declined to only $67 million in 2010. Now, last week, the Commission released the 2011 numbers for the over-the-air TV stations, and we have the CBC's number for English language drama for 2011. And it actually was $75 million, a little bounce back up to the earlier level. Now let's look at the drama spend by Bell. This combines the spending by the CTV stations with the drama spending on all of its specialty services like Bravo, Space, and Comedy. And you'll see that on a combined basis, it spent $67 million in 2008, but this declined to only $45 million in 2010. We now actually have the 2011 numbers, and the drama numbers declined still further to $36 million. So this is the history. Now let's go to Shaw. And you see this combines the spending on Canadian drama by Global with all its specialty services like Showcase and Mystery. And we see it adds about $38 million a year, dropping to $30 million in 2010. Now let's add Rogers. This covers the City TV stations and a few specialty services, and you can see they've spent very little on Canadian drama in the last few years, less than $5 million a year, so there's where you'll see Murdoch Mysteries. Now let's add Astral with its 3 English pay services, and you see they add about $30 million a year. And finally, we add Chorus. And through its pay services and its specialty services like YTV and W, it adds another $30 million or so. So when you add it all up, you get about $250 million for drama in 2008. But you see over the next 2 years, the total dropped significantly. Look at the arrow. In fact, drama spending dropped from $250 million to only $210 million in 2010, so that was bad news. But at least it gives you a base upon which to compare the projections for the future. So let's look at the impact of the Commission's P&I policy. And to figure this out, you have to understand the way the P&I calculation works. There are 4 steps in this. First, you have to take the revenue from each group's over-the-air services, Category A services and Category B with at least 1 million subs. Then you have to calculate how much the revenue is likely to increase over the next 5 years. Then you have to multiply that revenue by the magic P&I number, which is different for each broadcast group, remembering that it always works on a 1-year lag. And then finally, you have to add the P&I transfer benefits that were promised by Bell, Shaw, and Chorus when they acquired certain of their program services in the last couple of years. So we have these 4 steps. Now, I won't bore you with all my assumptions and calculations. You can get those in a short paper that will be available on the CMPA website. But what you really want to see are the results. So let's look at the results. And I'm going to start with the CBC. And here we have a problem because, as I mentioned, the CBC renewal hearings have been postponed. In its filing last year, the CBC committed to 7 hours of P&I programming in prime time each week, but gave no expenditure numbers. So we don't have specific estimates for their P&I spending. And the CBC will likely be affected by the government's budget cuts. So for the purposes of the discussion today, I simply took the average CBC drama spend for the past 3 years, $74.7 million per year, and said that will be its P&I spending for the next 5 years. And this is what it looks like. You'll see CBC is really a flat line at about $75 million a year. Now let's add Bell Media. Remember, Bell was only spending $45 million on Canadian drama in 2010, plus about $28 million on long-form docs. This year, 2012, the first bar on the left, it should be spending $87 million on P&I, and by 2016 it will be spending about $91 million. Now let's add Shaw Media. You'll see Shaw adds between $53 million and $72 million a year to the P&I spending. Now let's add Rogers. It adds a small piece of change, $7 million to $11 million a year on P&I. And then we add Astral's P&I spending, $32 million rising to $39 million a year. And finally, Chorus, $34 million on P&I rising to over $41 by 2016. So if we look at the big picture, we see that the total spending by broadcasters on English language P&I will be about $290 million in the current year. That's the year we're in today, and will increase to about $329 million in 2016. And these are significantly larger numbers than the drama numbers we saw back in 2008 to 2010. But of course, in evaluating the impact of these increases, it's important to realize that P&I includes expenditures on long-form documentaries and national award shows as well as drama. And in the case of Bell Media and Shaw Media, these expenditures on long-form docs and award shows were not small. In 2010, over $30 million each. However, expenditures on long-form docs or award shows were not as significant in the case of Rogers, Chorus, or Astral. So once you make the necessary adjustments to allow for long-form docs and award shows, the amount spent on Canadian drama and comedy will not be increasing as much as you might have hoped. However, it will still represent the lion's share of P&I spending, and we can therefore expect a gradual but significant rise in spending on Canadian television drama over the next few years, driven entirely by the private sector. About 11% of that total spending will be driven by transfer benefits, required by virtue of the Bell and Shaw ownership decisions. However, The likely increase in revenue for programming services over the next few years will also have a significant positive impact. So these are interesting numbers, but what do they mean? So that brings me to my analysis, and in particular, what will be the impact on the independent production sector in Canada? And for that purpose, I want to leave you with 10 takeaways. First, it's clear that the CRTC policy on programs of national interest, or PNI, will be the underpinning of the independent production sector in Canada. Without that policy and the requirement it imposes on Canadian broadcasters, the independent production sector would be a fraction of its current size and diversity. Second, the CBC is no longer the biggest single player in regard to PNI. There was a time in the 60s and 70s when the CBC was the only significant player commissioning Canadian English language TV drama and comedy. But over the 80s and 90s, the CRTC steadily increased the requirements for the private sector. And although the over-the-air sector lowered its spending on Canadian drama in the next 10 years, the expenditure requirements on the pay and specialty services kept overall spending up. Now, with group licensing and specific PNI requirements for each group, we will see a dramatic rise in private sector spending. So instead of just relying on the CBC, we now have 5 private players also commissioning English language drama and long-form docs. And the dollars are substantial. Bell Media will be the biggest player, with Shaw Media not far behind, and both Chorus and Astro will also be significant players. And Rogers is also subject to a small PNI requirement, although it will be only a bit player in this game. Overall, the private sector will account for over 75% of PNI spending by English language broadcasters in the next 5 years. So this is a dramatic change from the situation before. However, depending on its budget constraints, and we'll know those in a month or so, the CBC will still be an important player for distinctive Canadian drama and long-form docs. Now, looking at these numbers, some might argue that the Commission cracked down hard on the private broadcasters last July, but actually the private sector broadcasters got off relatively lightly. First of all, the PNI base numbers were based on historical expenditure numbers for PNI over the past 3 years, and these were at an all-time low for the conventional TV sector. Secondly, the Commission excluded the sports and news services from the denominator, and one can expect that both TSN, owned by Bell, and Sportsnet, owned by Rogers, will see significant revenue increases over the next few years, more than other specialty services. But these increases will not lead to increased PNI. And third, the accounting rules for PNI have been adjusted to help the broadcasters. They can now count equity investment fully towards PNI. And the private broadcasters also won a few victories in regard to scheduling. The over-the-air stations got rid of the priority program rules, which had required 8 hours a week of priority programs in prime time. And while they were not able to convince the Commission to reduce the 50% CanCon rule in evening hours for their conventional TV stations, they did score a victory in the day part, where effectively they can now run an extra half hour per day of foreign programming. Now, program producers and members of the creative community were no doubt unhappy that the PNI ratio was not set at levels higher than 5% for Bell or Shaw, or on a basis that would rise over the license period. However, the new PNI system has a number of features that are quite positive for independent producers. First, the requirement is expressed as a ratio, not a fixed dollar amount. So as revenues for the major broadcasters increase, the amount required to be spent on PNI will steadily increase as well. That being said, the Commission did not include revenue from the sports and news services from the denominator, so revenue increases in that sector will not affect PNI. Second, the Commission rescinded an earlier policy called the license fee top-up policy, which had allowed broadcasters to count Canada Media Fund contributions as if they had spent that themselves. The result is that the PNI expenditures I've shown you can only be met with real money. And third, the Commission has required that at least 75% of the P&I expenditures be spent with independent producers. And as you well know, the Commission pressured the over-the-air broadcasters to enter into terms of trade with your organization. Those were finalized last year and made the subject of a license condition in the renewal decisions. My next point is that Rogers dodged a bullet. As we were going through the numbers, you may have noticed that Rogers got off lightly. It is only subject to a 2.5% P&I ratio rising to 3, but it didn't get hit with a 5% level, which many had expected. But this will be revisited in 3 years because they got a short-term renewal, and we can expect some pressure for Rogers to increase its P&I spending. Now, the P&I policy represents a major step forward for the Commission. It moves away from scheduling rules for drama on particular services and moves towards expenditure rules applicable over all the group's broadcast services combined. And once those expenditures are made, the expenditures can be allocated to any of the services, just as a drama or a comedy program can show up on more than one broadcast service. Now, when there was only a scheduling requirement, which applied for a number of years, too often a private broadcaster may tend to focus on how to spend as little as possible to fill its schedule. But when you move to an expenditure requirement, the private broadcaster focuses on a different question. Namely, since I have to spend the money anyway, how do I get the highest ratings for the right demographic for the programs I commission? Now, the story is interesting. On the Canadian English language stations and services, you wouldn't be surprised to know that programs in the drama and comedy category accounted for 47% of overall viewing in 2009-10. It was the single most popular programming genre. And of this number, when you look at all the English language services, Canadian English language drama actually accounted for about 1/5 of that overall drama viewing. Now, it sounds like a relatively low number, but I think it represents a remarkable success story given the competition we have from Hollywood. And it will be very interesting to see if that 20% number starts to improve as the private broadcasters put more funding and a greater emphasis on ratings for their Canadian drama. Now, most of the P&I funding coming from broadcasters will be in the form of license fees. But they also get credit for script and concept development funding and for equity investment in Canadian programs. And for a Canadian English language drama costing $1.5 million an hour, the private broadcaster license fee typically covers only 22% of the cost. The rest must be financed through other means. We are now seeing that in order to garner a U.S. presale, that production cost per hour can escalate to well north of $2 million an hour. And so the P&I policy is only the starting point. Creative financing and cost control will still be a crucial part of the equation. Now, some observers, noting the successful pre-sale rights to certain Canadian drama series to the U.S. commercial networks, have argued that this is where the future lies. And it's true, CBS has bought Flashpoint, which is on CTV, ABC has bought Rookie Blue, which is on Global, NBC has bought The Firm, also on Global. From a Canadian broadcaster's standpoint, these programs represent the Holy Grail. Not only do they count as high-value Canadian shows, but they can be simulcast against the U.S. border stations, thereby increasing the audience. However, let's face it, there's a limit to this approach. 4 other Canadian drama series that had U.S. pre-sales, CBC's The Border, CTV's The Listener, The Bridge, Global's Combat Hospital, they were all ordered and then not renewed by ION, NBC, CBS, and ABC, respectively. And even where Canadian drama series can be pre-sold into the United States, some harsh realities need to be borne in mind. The prices obtained for domestic programs in the export market are still only a small fraction of their production costs. And frankly, I've looked at this, all countries around the world finance their indigenous programs largely from their domestic market and then sell their programs abroad, if they can sell them at all, at prices that are a fraction of cost. A key reason why CBS was interested in CTV's Flashpoint was that it could acquire the U.S. rights for a fraction of the cost to commission a new U.S.-made drama series, and the bulk of the cost of making Flashpoint came from Canadian subsidies, Canadian tax credits, and Canadian license fees. Without that support, the program would not have been made. That being said, Canada has had some remarkable success in selling police procedurals to the U.S. networks, at least as replacements for summer reruns. But as we all know, comedy, which is more culturally specific and more execution dependent, is a much more difficult genre to export. Before concluding, I should add one other caveat, and that is that the P&I policy does not address the problems faced by Canadian feature films. Yes, feature films count as P&I, but as I explained in a keynote address made to this group 3 years ago, Canadian broadcasters have largely abandoned their support for Canadian feature films, and there is nothing in the P&I policy to require them to do otherwise. So to my final point. Just how important is the P&I policy for independent TV production in Canada? And the numbers show it's not just important, it's crucial. The key source of financing for drama and long-form docs comes from private broadcaster license fees, and that is driven entirely by the P&I policy. Absent that policy, it would make economic sense for private broadcasters to buy only Hollywood drama at a fraction of the cost of Canadian drama, and from an economic sense, they would find it in their interest to focus their CanCon budget almost entirely on news, sports, and magazine shows, and maybe some reality shows. But the P&I policy requires them to spend meaningful dollars on Canadian drama, long-form docs, and national award shows. So where you see license fees of 22% of the drama budget coming from private broadcasters, that's largely a creature of regulation. But more important, it's the key trigger which enables the other funding mechanisms to come into play. So whether it's the form of tax credits, CMF money, Canadian distribution fees, or foreign pre-sales, none of them will come into being unless there's a Canadian broadcaster license in place. Now, on February 7 last month, the chair of the OMDC celebrated Ontario's film and TV industry, and she noted that Ontario's film and TV production activity in 2011 contributed $1.26 billion to the economy, and domestic TV series in Ontario were $626.7 million in 2011. Now, most of those series would not exist except for CRTC policy. And for every dollar that the P&I policy requires private broadcasters to spend, there's a multiplier effect. Upwards of another $4 is added from other sources, the tax credits, the CMF, the distributor fees, the foreign sales, the other sources, to enable those series to be completed. But it all starts with CRTC policy, and in particular, the P&I policy. It is not an exaggeration to say that it provides the crucial underpinning for the whole independent production sector. Thank you very much.